Here is my remake of Sango's Amor. The Sango sample library and this project are both linked below. If you enjoy my tutorials, please drop this video a like and consider subscribing, as it helps me out by showing my content to more people. For the purists, I have brought in and rearranged the vocals after the drop down here to make things more dynamic in this 16-bar loop. If you have any questions you'd like to ask me directly, then please tweet me at Matthew Vere, that's Vere, or join our community on Discord, linked below. The chapters and timestamps should be part of the video's timeline, but if not, you can find them down below. I had fun making this one. Sango's sampling style is more intricate than I thought before diving into this remake. I guess we should start there then, with the samples. The first sample comes from the Brownstones. There is some confusion online around which version though. Who Sampled states it's from the original, but the sample actually comes from the Funk remix that I've linked below. I was searching for ages for this sample online. I knew the chords were a sample due to the pitch artifacts present, indicating time stretching had been applied. I initially tried to recreate them, but it just didn't sound right. Combined with the vocal sample and the high-pitched sound, I knew I had to find the original to make this remake work. I found the Funk remix on YouTube from a comment someone left on Who Sampled, mentioning the track's source. However, the first version I found on YouTube was the original song, but mistitled. After more digging, I found the correct version and heard this at 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The magical 420 gods delivered again. A wide grin crept across my face. Only producers understand the excitement one has upon finding a sample. I sat there listening, laughing and lamenting before swiftly opening Ableton. Somehow the track ended up on my computer, so I dropped it into a fresh Ableton session. Found the given section, chopped it out, placed it on a new track, tightened up the loop points and consolidated it. My BPM is 130, the tempo of the original, so I know it should fit within 4 bars. Let's add a warp marker at the end and drag it to bar 5. No, none of these sound right. How about using the re-pitch function? Hello Sango. The last step is then a high pass at 100 Hz. Then we have Media Mar. As you know, this sample is the bedrock for the track, playing throughout the whole song. We've got an EQ high passing the sample, as I just mentioned, then a compressor that I'm using to soften the transients of the piano. Softening them was necessary lest they interfere with the transients from my drums. If I zoom in on the sample, you can see that I've not used warp markers to tighten up the timing. This is for the same reason as the compressor. The transients from the piano chords are hitting just after the drums do, keeping them out of the way of one another. An essential quality in this style of music is hard-hitting drums. Paying attention to your drum transients and giving them space is but one method of achieving this. Another is sidechaining. This is what the second compressor is doing. I like to control the sidechaining and the compression independently across two separate devices. My reasoning is twofold. I want the sound of the sidechaining, the ducking or pumping effect, but I also wish to ensure the drums do come through clean, without obstruction. The sound of a sidechain provides a movement or groove to this track. The last plugin is RC20 from XLN Audio, applying some vinyl-like characteristics to the sample. The sample naturally contains some vinyl crackle, however, I wish to emphasize that as I thought it would provide an added layer of texture to the track. Here's a before and after of the whole chain. I think the genius of this track is the combination of the three samples. Sango has combined two samples from two different worlds and brought them together to create an exceptional track. Here's the second sample, which I think is the most iconic.
Get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to da. Meu nome é Vala. Get it to da, da 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 da.
Most know the origins of this sample. It's from... I won't disrespect the artists and culture by butchering the pronunciation with my limited unworldly vocabulary. I've added a bunch of links to the group and their work in this video's index article, which is linked below. The genre of this sample and the next is Bali Funk or Bali Funk, which is similar in phrasing to hip hop and originates from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The word Bali Funk or Bali Funk seems to refer to the parties or clubs that host the music, not the genre itself. Admittedly, this genre was introduced to me by Media Mar or Sango, so if there are any viewers more familiar with the music and culture, please leave comments below to educate us all. Much like with the first sample, there's a misconception online about the actual section that Sango has sampled. Most presume it's this section. I did myself to begin with, until I noticed that in Sango's version, the sample doesn't have the backing drums and percussion. Take a listen to Sango's. Get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to da. Meu nome é Vala. Get it to da. Then the original. Get it to da, get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to. Looking then at my version, you'll notice that I've chopped the sample up into small chunks, which is what Sango has done in Media Mar. I'll give it to him, he did an incredible job flipping this sample. There are two small sections in the original track that once chopped can be arranged into this pattern. Here they are in the original. Get it to da, get it to, get it to. The first thing I did was smooth out those volume discrepancies so each chop would work together. Once arranged, we get
get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da.
The next version repeats a voice phrase an extra time for variation.
Get it to get it to get it to da, da 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 da, get it to get it to get it to da.
This leads us to the third and final sample arrangement. Say what you want about sampling, but you can't argue with Sango's creativity with these chops. Initially, people speculate and presume the producer hasn't applied much creativity to the flip. This can be the case, but from actually recreating tracks for these tutorials, often the opposite is the case, and you don't realise the intricacies until you start piecing together a remake. Sango has a few more variations throughout the original. I brought one forward to use a little earlier in my remake, just to showcase more of the track.
Get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to da, get it to da.
On to the next sample, which is the no money phrase and comes from the same track. The effects look strikingly similar to that of the first sample, minus the sidechaining. This vocal is the central element in Amor, and is the element I always remember first whenever I think of it. It's already providing much of the rhythm with its natural cadences and Sango's arrangement. Sidechaining would, I think, counteract that. Here's a before and after of the whole effects chain.
Get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da, get it to get it to get it to da, da 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 da, get it to get it to get it to da, get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da, da 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 da, get it to get it to get it to da, da 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 da, get it to get it, da 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 da, get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da. Get it to get it to get it to da, da 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 da, get it to get it to get it to da.
The final sample I couldn't find. Undoubtedly, someone will post it in the comments and the imperfection of this remake will haunt me until my dying day. Nevertheless, while putting together this remake, I listened to much Barley Funk and happened to stumble across a similar enough substitute.
Get it to da, get it to da, da 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 da.
It's a straight 8-bar sample from the original track, no chopping undergone. I've pitched it up a couple of semitones to match Sango's and used warp markers to keep the timing strict. I'll link a Spotify playlist below with some more Barley Funk tracks you can sample. The chain is again the same as the previous two, with the addition of a stereo imager that's widening the top end up to around 10k. I'll speak more on stereo imaging and my approach with it in this project in the drums chapter. Here's a before and after of the whole chain. The main difference is the removal of that low thud, which is a drum I think, and the slight added width of the stereo imaging. The imaging moves it out to the sides of the track, out of the way of the brownstones and the main vocal sample. Onto the drums. Altogether, the drums sound like this. We'll start with the kick drum, which is from my Sango sample library, linked below. Here's how it sounds. For my regular viewers, I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say this, but your success with drums comes down to sample selection. I'm not applying any effects to this kick. Obviously, I made the pack in the style of Sango, but the point is to find the ideal sample without having to apply a bunch of subsequent effects. If you're not interested in purchasing my packs, I'd recommend using drum sounds from vintage samplers, as these typically have the low punch required for this style of music. The one aspect I'd recommend you pay attention to is trimming any silence or gaps at the beginning of drums, especially when layering sounds. Samples other than mine often have different start times, which can lead to some phase issues caused by misalignment. It's a geeky subject, but one that will lead to sharper drum hits when paid attention to. The snare drum is made from 5 separate samples and sounds like so. When layering a snare, obviously the actual sound or tone is the guiding star for making adjustments, but for punch, find a snare that has a low fundamental frequency. You want the snare to hit you in your gut when played through monitors. I've specifically designed the snares in my pack for just this. Look for snares with a body around 200 to 600 Hz. You're looking for a fundamental frequency in that area, which you can use a tool like Span by Sango, which is free, to find. Focusing on clean transients will give you an edge. There's no processing on any of the individual snares either. I've saved everything for the drum group channel. This next element I spent the longest on, the hats. The hi-hats in the original track are the glue holding the beat together, but they also provide a large majority of the groove. 16th hats are boring and overdone in this style of music. Sangos sound like they're slowing and speeding up throughout, with various triplets and rolls thrown in for good measure. Listen again to mine, which are close but not perfect. Obviously the velocity plays a big role in creating rhythmical hats, but so does the actual structure and placement of the hats in the MIDI clip. This taught me to spend more time on my own hats in my drum grooves, as it's typically something like many I overlook. The kick and snare groove are predefined to an extent with this style of music and swing pattern, but the hi-hats and percussion are where you can show more creativity and develop a rhythmical section that's uniquely yours. The only individual processing on the hats is this imager increasing the stereo width up to around 10K. Again though, I've been saving my stereo image speech for this next section, the group processing on the drums. We start with an EQ, rolling off some of the ultra highs, mainly from the hats and top end from the snare, pushing both back in the mix. The next is a compressor. Quick side note, you can right click down here to jump to a plugin rather than scrolling through your list. This is handy for long chains. I went a bit mad in the Discord a few months ago, coming to some new insights about compression. I discovered that I didn't understand compression and have since developed a new framework for both understanding and teaching the concept. I'm speaking broadly of course, but this is a safe compressor setup for this kind of music. As I've mentioned throughout this video, the hard hitting sound is a result of correct compression, i.e. transient processing. I've aimed for around 6 to 8 decibels of gain reduction on these drums. Then comes the R20 color. I'm running the same preset for the vinyl crackle, but to also roll off some of the ultra top end from the hats. The latter was a side effect from merely using the plugin, but I do like the warm effect that it applies. And thank you to today's sponsor, iZotope. I'm kidding, but it probably does look that way. Live doesn't have a stereo imager, I've had to pull out Ozone to provide some of the width in the high mids. Generally, you want your track looking like a Christmas tree when it comes to stereo imaging. Mono sub, gently widen the track up to around 8K and then leave the highs in stereo, just not widened. You could probably even add a star with creatively shaped 16-bit dither, but that's a tutorial for another day. Here's a before and after of what I'm widening. It predominantly affects the snare drum, but there's also the top end of the kick and some of the hat mixed in there for good measure. I like working with frequency bands as opposed to individual instruments in this context, as I found it allows for more natural and creative processing. The last plugin I'm using as a transient shaper, and compressor too apparently. Transient shaping is the synth envelope for audiophiles. It allows you to control the shape of a sound over time. It splits into attack and sustain, which kind of doubles as the release. Parameters like delay or hold, as found in envelopes, cannot be altered in this fashion. This transient shaper goes one step further and allows you to split your processing into multiple frequency bands. Mine was initially split into 3, low, mid and high, but I since turned that off as I wasn't really hearing a difference between that and this setup we've got here. Take a listen to how it sounds. Can you hear how it tightens the snare up? It's best to do this before compression too, as you'll want to compress the new version of your drums, not how they sounded before transient shaping was applied. Or both, as I've done here. I believe that's why I added this compressor here. Neutron is a real treat to use too. This visual representation of everything aids with the learning of complex topics, like compression. I'd recommend using a compressor that has visual readouts purely to aid your understanding. On to the 808. The bass, from what I can tell, is an 808 sidechain to the kick drum, allowing it to move with the rhythm of the kick. Here's how it sounds soloed and without the sidechain activated. Then, alongside the kick drum, the 808 is from my Sango sample library, along with 29 others. The notes of the bass are aligned with where my kick lands, allowing for an added amount of cohesion between the two instruments. Again, high quality samples that come key labelled are paramount here. To provide further separation between the 808 and kick drum, I have pulled out the fundamental frequency of the low notes. Basically, I'm increasing the pitch sensor of the 808 more, pulling it away from the pitch of the kick drum. The two channels are identical except for the notes. The top track is playing the E0 note, then the bottom channel is playing an octave higher E1 note. I've separated them to have more delicate control over the loudness discrepancy between the two. You can see though, this ended up not really being necessary. The EQ is high passing the sound, although it's not removing much. Sometimes, if there's any nice overtones present from saturation distorting the harmonics, I'll leave them in there as it adds a mid-range tone that can help it cut through a dense mix. The saturators are next, adding some harmonic distortion. It sounds worse with them on just because I've got the output cranked right down here. Next is the trusty compressor. I'm using him here to reduce the transients of the 808. It has the added benefit of bringing up the tail in volume also. The kick drum is my transient in this sound partnership, while the 808 I want a fraction of a second later, providing the heavy body and tail. The transient shaper next is reducing the attack of the 808 pre-compressor, which allows the compressor to catch whatever remains. Going back to a subject I mentioned a little earlier, the attack here is set to the fastest possible setting, so the compressor acts immediately, as I want it to catch the transients in this case. Annoyingly, the Pro C doesn't have a 0 milliseconds or instantaneous attack setting, although there's probably not too many people that care about that. The release is long, holding the tail of the 808 up a little longer, as it does still decay a little too quickly for my liking. The knee is then as sharp as it will go, which you can see depicted here. I want a very attacky, clicky compression style, precise if you will. The knee controls the transition between the threshold curve, so between the non-compressed and the compressed signal. Imagine a DJ fader. A hard knee is a fast flick of a transition, a slow knee is a very gradual fade into a new song. A hard knee will sharpen the impact of a compressor, meaning it reacts as quick as it can to the signal that passes over the threshold. You can see this visually depicted here. When I change towards a softer knee setting, the line becomes more rounded, providing a smoother transition. I found hard knees to be best on drums, and softer knees for more organic sounds like vocals, pads, etc. Here's a before and after of the whole chain. The 808's lost its kick-like qualities and is much smoother across the board as a result. On the reverb bus, I'm using iZotope's new Reverb. I've made a video on my second channel comparing this to Sonable's Smart Verb 2 that's linked below. The preset was generated using the AI assistant tool. Rolling off the low frequencies of reverb is crucial to avoid a muddy mix. The only frequencies under 250 Hz should be in mono anyway, which is something you'll see in the next chapter. Here's a before and after of the Verb. Second EQ is boosting the size of the track around 10k for added sparkle and shimmer. I usually apply this on the master, but it worked better on the reverb for this project. I always think of these frequencies as the ones that tickle your ears. The last EQ is a high pass to remove everything under 100 Hz. I've done this at the end of every channel, whether I've shown it or not, apart from the 808 and the kick drum. The brick wall filters in the Pro Q are just that, and provide a definite cutoff point. I always run it in linear phase mode, otherwise the severity of the brick wall filtering cuts will cause phase issues. But that's enough on the reverb, on to the last chapter, mastering. I've got two mastering chains on here, an Ableton only and a basic third-party example. I gave this mastering chain away in my article on how to get SoundCloud's new mastering service for free, link below. I've provided the chain for a free download below too. It's not complicated, but it will save you the 5 minutes copying it over. Onto the actual mastering chain for this project. The cut at 221 Hz is rolling off everything under that frequency from the sides of the track, effectively monoing everything under this cutoff point. The reason for the specific 221 Hz value is because under that we've got the kick and the bass, and sitting just above that is the bottom end of the snare. 200 to 250 Hz are my regular goalposts. It's essential to adjust and tailor fit the cut to the material in question. You can use the analyzer to spot where an appropriate point may be. The low pass here at 17 kHz is one that many forget to make. Remake. Generally, you want to begin removing the highs around 15 kHz with a gentle slope that arcs off the curve neatly. This is something I learned from studying plenty of reference material that was professionally mixed. However, as I've gotten older and my taste developed, having the highs curved off provides a more comfortable listening experience, as high end is uncomfortable to our ears, especially at high volumes. Here's a before and after. The difference isn't that obvious on this example, as I've made it a habit to roll off the highs throughout this project, but it does make a visual difference on the meter. The next couple of plugins aren't that interesting. The Saturn is providing some harmonic distortion and a compressor for light glue compression consisting of around 3 decibels of gain reduction. I've then got this EQ matching my frequency curvature to that of Sango's Amor track. The orange was Sango's and the blue mine, and this was before EQ matching. You can see I had it pretty damn close before processing, but this plugin put the cherry on top. Here's a before and after of just that element. The increase in the high end is the main added element I'm hearing. Worth noting too, I placed this plugin at the beginning of my chain to capture a sonic picture of Sango's track so as to not run his work through my mastering chain. I then placed it back towards the end of my chain to apply the differences as my track sounds with all of the mastering plugins before it. One thing I was paying a lot of attention to throughout this track was the stereo imaging. Using this sound field view on Insight, I ensured all of the samples were balanced to the center. If you've seen any weird panning adjustments, it was just to balance them back to the center here. When you're working with older samples, mostly from vinyl or low quality sources, this becomes paramount to check. I had a play with the low end focus module too. Before I describe what it's doing, take a listen. This tool allows you to select an instrument within the selected frequency range to take center stage. In this project, we have the option to either focus on the 808 or the kick drum or some mix between the two. The smooth mode is suited towards tonal material and the punchy for transient sounds. The critical listeners may be noticing a discrepancy between the current project and the track played at the beginning of this tutorial. From this point, I mastered the track you heard at the beginning of the tutorial in Ozone Standalone, which is why this track still sounds unfocused and unfinished. We'll now head over to Ozone Standalone as it sets my CPU on fire when opened in Ableton. If you don't have Ozone, I would normally end this chain with a limiter. You can find my mastering settings in any of the previous tutorials. For those that haven't watched this tutorial in its entirety, I've begun sharing all of my notes from everything music production related I consume on Vere.audio. That's Vere.audio. And there's bags of gold on there already, like both seasons of the mastering series Isotope have released here on YouTube with mastering engineer Jonathan Weiner. And it's honestly the best quality series I've watched here on YouTube and can't believe it's free. All of my notes from these tutorials are available on Vere.audio for free, so please feel free to have a browse around. I've used what I've learnt from these tutorials as a guide for approaching this master. Now, for the nitty gritty technical stuff, I recommend having a browse through them and try applying what you've learnt to your own music. Starting off this chain, I'm using the Match EQ module, and of course I did use this inside of Ableton, but have repeated the process here. I'm only applying 8% of the information, which is pretty much all in the high end. Here's a before and after of just this module. In this case, I'm obviously recreating a track, but in your case, it would be useful to have references open in these tabs, close in tone or style to the work you're mastering. Ensure they're in WAV format too, no MP3s or YouTube rips. I then kept the tonal balance plugin open next to this main window, like so. Now this plugin has had thousands of records ran through it, and with machine learning has calculated the average frequency distribution across different styles of music. It's a useful tool to see if you're in the ballpark for what's considered a normal mix, but of course there are no rules within music. Initially, my bass was too loud, going outside of this curve here, and you can even see now I'm still at the limit. Once I brought back the bass, I could then increase the average loudness of the mix, which brought out the top end and stereo width. I hadn't considered the trade-offs when deciding to have a loud bass section, which leads to a perceived darker and less spacious mix when listened to at the same volume. I've got three things happening on the EQ. A boost at 500 Hz, which lifts the punch of the snare and the bottom end of the vocals, bringing them slightly forward in the mix. If I play the track without, you'll notice on the tonal balance there's a sag in this 500 Hz region, but then with the boost, the dip evens itself out. The tonal balance takes a few seconds to update. Let me play it again and listen for how the bottom end of the vocals comes forward, making them feel closer in the mix. It's very subtle, so don't be alarmed if you can't hear a difference. Here's just the band of frequencies I'm boosting. The cut at 8.2K is removing or toning down that high-pitched cricket sound in the brownstone sample. If I turn it off, you can see we've got a tiny peak here, right on this crossover line. If I engage the EQ, the curve then smooths back out, and the cricket sound gets slightly quieter. Have a listen. The last adjustment is in a high shelf to tone down some of the top end from the hats. The hi-hats are loud in the original, but not sharp to the ears. Here's a before and after. Then a before and after of the whole EQ module. Without the EQ, the track sounds bright but a little hollow in the middle, and with the EQ, I think it sounds just right. Generally, I don't reach for our multiband if I have access to the project file, as I can make individualized treatments on the given channel. This 2-band setup is more of a classic option for bass heavy tracks. If I didn't have a band for the bass and another for everything else, the bass section would trigger the compressor before everything else has a chance. So I'd be effectively only compressing my bass signal, which for mastering glue is not what we want. If you want a dense wall of sound style of mix, a compressor can help bring everything together and give you what we call glue or cohesion. For the punch, we want to bring the transients forward. The recipe for this is letting the transient come through with a long attack time, 50 milliseconds, quick release, 100 milliseconds, and a low ratio, 2:1. This enables the compressor to allow the transient through before the rest of the sound is pulled up or compressed. The compressor isn't kicking in until after 50 milliseconds has passed of the signal going over the threshold, and that 50 milliseconds attack lets the transient of the drum come through uncompressed or unaffected. I've then got a long release time which provides a smoothing effect across the track and is generally encouraged in mastering. Here's a before and after of both bands, and note I'm reducing the bass in volume, so when bypassed the bass will get a little louder. The exciter is then adding saturation or harmonic distortion to 4 frequency bands, and the selection of modes I've made down here are just based on what sounded right for the given band. The main difference I'm hearing is of course a few dB of gain, but also a thickness across the whole project. Harmonic distortion adds in additional frequencies, which confirms the gain and thickness I'm hearing. I think it's important not just to understand theoretically, but also audibly what each effect is supposed to be adding into a sound, and also what you are hearing to ensure they both align. The imager is then splitting the bands into a very similar 4-band setup as the exciter. I'm not widening the low end, but there is some stereo information mixed in there. Starting at 250Hz, I'm then progressively increasing the width of each band. I'll now play each band while A-Bing the imaging on each. The important thing to keep in mind with stereo imaging is to be aware of the trade-offs you're making. For example, raising the stereo information of the midband may alter your mix and create some competition between the elements in this region. Earlier in this tutorial, I spoke about making your stereo width adjustments in line with the shape of a Christmas tree. This is good advice when mixing individual elements, as I think the more global changes should be left until the mastering, but of course, it's not a hard and fast rule. Because Sango's hi-hats are allowed in the original, I spread out the highs in my mix to try and balance them with the rest of the track. In mastering, you can push the width of the top end the most, as there are fewer instruments in this region that will interfere with the main instruments in most styles of music. Onto the tape module. Who doesn't love the sound of tape saturation? This module is based on the Studer, or Studer depending on where you're from, A810 tape machine, known for its accurate frequency response across the whole spectrum, or accurate as far as tape goes. If I first solo it, you'll notice the bias control has a dark, warm sound when at 10, and a bright but lacking in low end sound when set to -10. If I hover over the control, it gives a rather complicated explanation. From their website, the bias control allows for precise tuning of frequency and distortion response, which can be weighted either way, as we've seen. As I've weighted it towards the lows, leaving me with a subdued high end, I've compensated by adding them back in here with the high emphasis slider. The harmonics control is then what you would expect, the harmonic distortion. This has quite an effect on the tonal balance of the song, but it is a sound I love. One last thing that I think is worth mentioning is the speed control here, or the IPS, or inches per second, which historically refers to the speed at which the tape on a recorder is moving across the heads. Each selection here has a different sound, 7.5 being the warmest through to 30 being the brightest. But the world of tape is of course a tutorial or tutorial series in itself, but the sound can enhance almost any kind of music. The last element is then our limiter, which has a ceiling of 0.3 decibels with true peak turned on, meaning it will not distort on analog gear or outside of the digital domain. These modes down here, I've got a bunch of notes on, which you can find on Vere.audio, linked below. With regards to the level, I'm not mastering to a specific level. This track's a little hot on the LUFS front. Around -14 decibels would be a safer option if it's going out to streaming services. But for more information on this, again head to my website, Vere.audio. Okay, that's it for this one. Thank you as always for continuing this journey with me. Please keep the recommendations pouring in as for who I should cover next. Check out the companion index article, Vere.audio, that's VERE.audio. Subscribe, like, and all of that goodness. And if you have any questions, please tweet me at Matthew Vere, that's Vere, linked below, or join our community's Discord, also linked below. I'll see you in the next one.